the new jams. I'm feeling them, man. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the MLB Strategy Show, the first of the year. It's going to be a little bit different, though, because we're going to get into not only how to work with tomorrow's upcoming slate. I won't call it opening day. I'll call it the first night of baseball. Opening day is not until Friday, but we've got big contests across the industry, and we're going to break them down. But we're going to take a look on a little more, on a slightly deeper level. I want to help anybody from a fantasy cruncher sense or from a lineup builder, single entry, three max sense. I want to get to everybody here, from a beginner to an intermediate level to, I think, even an advanced level based on who we've got on this show. And that is Alex Baker, #1 ranked DFS player in the world. You might know him as Awesemo. Josh Engleman and Jake Hari. I'm Dave Loughran. And we got Jordan Klein behind the glass producing today's show. We got a four-man crew, four-man booth, and a lot to get into. Josh, I think when you and I kind of set up the 3-day schedule, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, leading up to tomorrow's slate, the purpose was kind of, all right, get everybody back into the groove, which is tough for all of us to do. Understand how the 60-game season affects everything. Tuesday, talk about projections and ownership and top stack tools and how to view stacks. And then today, kind of take all of that and put it together and come full circle from where we began. And you can check all of those shows out, by the way, on the SiriusXM app. Just search Awesemo Radio right here at youtube.com/Awesemo. But yeah, Josh, this is the culmination here, day 3 before we get started.
Yeah, I'm so pumped. I dove in this morning, got up, went for a run, sat down, and have been in Excel ever since, which is honestly like a perfect day for me. I cannot wait to play. I didn't realize that I was going to be so excited for baseball. Now I like actually am. Ran my first crunch this morning, looking at my exposures. It feels like we've had it forever. It doesn't feel like it's been gone for so long.
How far of a run did you go for?
2.5 miles.
Did you time yourself?
Yes.
How'd you do?
I can give you that answer in a second.
Oh, come on. You should know that off the top of your head. I mean, give me an estimate. No, nothing good. Because I did
24 minutes and 12 seconds, 2.54 miles.
Not too bad.
9 minute and 30 second pace.
I'm averaging solid 10.5 minute miles right now, which for a smoker, I take pride in that. Alex, the one thing we discussed before getting started today was the idea that not everybody has complex, complicated Excel sheets where they can sort lineups, where they can do a lot of extra stuff outside of Cruncher. So the primary objective here, not just for Cruncher, but for building lineups by hand, is to give people ways and means to make these lineups without having to take that extra step, because not everyone has that accessibility.
Yeah, definitely. Running's not in my wheelhouse, but lineup construction certainly is.
Running crunches certainly is.
That's a good point, yeah. Yeah, so like the most important thing before you start building your lineup is you have to understand the context of the slate. And that's why we have so many great shows on YouTube with all of us giving you that kind of analysis of the broad picture of that day. Because once you understand that, then lineups come pretty easy. And then we have all the tools on the website as well that help you kind of break down the slate. The easiest one for baseball, I think, is Top Stacks tool, because it kind of gives you how much is every team owned and what are their chances of succeeding that day based on the projections. And that really helps you kind of distill the slate into a much more easy to digest format.
I think we need to create t-shirts that say "Run crunches, not miles." That would be pretty solid, wouldn't it? I think everybody would wear them. Jake,
I'm in.
We're going to get into the weeds in a moment, but I kind of want to start off on a basic level. And by the way, as always, we're happy to have everybody with us. Thanks for joining. If you have any questions throughout the show in chat, we'll monitor that and try and get to them maybe during the middle or anywhere throughout the show, definitely at the end like we did yesterday. But Jake, what do you think, before we dive into this, are the biggest mistakes that people make when it comes to using a service like Fantasy Cruncher? Where do they go wrong to where they get frustrated, throw their hands up and say, you know what, I have good projections. I see other people winning. I have good ownership projections. I see other people winning. Why am I not winning with the same information that everyone else has?
Yeah, I think, like times have changed in DFS, and you can't just load up projections, especially in a sport like MLB or PGA. I see people talking about PGA projections being off or whatever. But like you guys talked about yesterday on the show, like these are for median, these are median projections. So that these aren't going to happen all the time. And I think people misunderstand that. Like you guys talked about yesterday, like Mike Trout can go 0 for 4, 0 for 5, and be 25% owned. And so people get really frustrated when what they think is going to happen doesn't happen in MLB. And it's a really long grind, but you need to figure out a way to use all the tools on our site in conjunction with each other. And I think Alex mentioned the top stack tool is a great way to get like a quick summary on the slate and see who's over-owned, who's under-owned, which are stacks you need in your crunches, which are maybe some stacks you might want to avoid or avoid having a lot of. So there's a ton of different things, but like all these tools work together, and you can't just use ownership projections. You can't just use projections. You need to use a combination of both.
So Josh, when you're trying to use that combination, right? So like I said, you've got the projections, you've got ownership, and you've got Fantasy Cruncher. You've got all three of them. How do you start? Let's start very basic. You've got all of this. How do you start integrating them into Fantasy Cruncher to make crunches that actually can make money?
Well, the dream scenario is that you are an Awesemo.com sub, and that information is just immediately into your Fantasy Cruncher app. So first and foremost, that's the perfect way to do it. Save yourself a couple steps. First thing that I want to do, though, seriously, is put the projections into Fantasy Cruncher, whether they're there automatically or you're loading them yourself, and run a completely unencumbered crunch. No settings. Everybody's 100%. No randomness, no change to uniques, nothing. I want to know what the optimal score is based on those projections so that I have a baseline for the rest of what I'm doing. Because if I don't know what the actual top is, then there's no context for me for every other lineup that I look at.
Okay, so elaborate on that a little bit then.
Okay.
What's up?
Okay, I'm in.
Yeah, elaborate that on that a little bit. So you're talking. So you can have this information, but it might actually be useless to you unless.
Yeah, so it's a key piece of knowing what you're doing for a particular slate is knowing how all of the data works together. If you don't know what your personal optimal lineup is using those projections, there's no real way for you to look at the rest of the lineups that you've crunched and know if that fantasy projection is good or bad, because you don't give yourself the top of the food chain for it. That number then also becomes very important for lineup ownership. If you start making a couple changes in a lineup that's optimal, and let's say that you want to cut off, two major chalky guys, but the two replacements that you put in have brought down your total fantasy projection by, 25 points or something really crazy. You're going from high end to low end. You want to know what you're trading off in ownership for those fantasy points. It's all so layered together. But to me, knowing what your optimal is, seeing if that optimal is owned, that's going to give you a lot of ideas of directions you should go for cash games for sure. It's just a great place to start knowing what your peak is.
Yeah, and Alex, again, yesterday we talked quite a bit about that, but for anyone just tuning in, or, it's a good thing to reinforce to begin with. How do you decide when you're forget about Fantasy Cruncher? It could be Fantasy Cruncher, it could be hand building lineups. How do you decide in a sport like baseball, where players all fail more than they succeed, what chalk is good chalk and what chalk should be played, which chalk should have lower exposure to, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, in general in baseball, I think people gravitate towards the teams that are priced the best. And a lot of the times, the teams that are really good that just are a little bit too expensive slip through the cracks a little bit. And as a general rule, those tend to be my favorite stacks because it's you're competing with a lot less people when they have a big night. And any team in baseball can have a big night pretty much. Of course, the odds are really important, and a team that has like a 6-team total or is going to score 6 runs on average is quite a bit more valuable than one that's projected to score 5. But this is all in the context of ownership. So we're trying to balance like what are the chances each team succeeds versus how many people are on them.
Would you say on average your best nights come when the chalk does poorly?
Yeah, I mean, like my most nights, it's like funny that like the nights that I score the highest, like I'm always not winning anything. But like it's the nights where like the winning score is low. That's when I have a really good shot. So it's like people really gravitate towards those chalky lineups that like Coors Field, it could produce a lineup that has 250 points. But if everyone else has 252, that doesn't really do much for you.
Yeah, Jake, it is a very interesting concept knowing that, as Alex said, his best nights come when the field the field on average is scoring much lower. The winning lineup, the winning scores or the highest scores are much lower than they'd be maybe the night before or the night after that. But, that's just one piece of the puzzle. There's a way that you have to get there. And I think there's a lot of confusion regarding, okay, well, how do I do this without being stupid, right? How do I do this by not just playing a lot of low-owned players that are just outright bad plays and finding the ones that actually make sense as low-end players that have potential to win me a tournament? There's definitely a disconnect there between a lot of people trying to figure out how to get into on low ownership without, making just the flat out wrong plays.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I like to do in Fantasy Cruncher, like Josh mentioned, just run it and kind of see what like the ownership sums are coming up. Like some of the top lineups like might have tomorrow, just for example, just throwing out a number like 220% total ownership. But if you have two guys that are one guy that's under 10%, which is hard to do on a 2-game slate, your lineup might have a chance of being unique while also having a really good projection and lower ownership than a bunch of other lineups that are similar. And going back to what Alex said about doing well on nights where the top score is kind of low and Coors doesn't go off and the Red Sox or whoever, the top team is of that night, if multiple of the chalkiest teams go off, like that's probably not a recipe for success. You have to be essentially perfect. Whereas if a couple teams bust here, maybe one chalk team goes off, but you have the low owned filler stack with them, the winning scores are going to be substantially lower even in large field tournaments, but there's more paths to victory rather than just having to hit on every single guy in your lineup. Like we see, I feel like a lot of Alex's lineups, like he has a couple guys in his winning lineups that might score 8 points or 10 points. And whereas if you stack Coors and they score 13 runs, like you're going to have basically everyone in your lineup to win a tournament is going to have to get 15, 20, 30 points. Everyone's going to have to hit a home run or something like that.
All three of you guys talked about it, but Josh, when you narrow it down a little bit, trying to find those less popular stacks that have similar upside, similar ceilings, and in baseball, it's so much different than basketball because, Giannis could be 40% owned and he's still the best play because he has more opportunity. Mike Trout has as much opportunity as most, 3-hole hitters or 2-hole hitters. So it's there's a lot more of a differentiation there. How are you looking through a slate where I know it's all slate specific, but let's try and narrow it down to a Coors Field slate. You have Adrian Sampson on the mound, just because we saw that from last year. Adrian Sampson on the mound, and Coors is absolutely wildly popular across the board. We'll say DraftKings, but all these guys are very expensive. Do you usually end up in a spot where you still have a lot of Coors, but you make sure to get different elsewhere? Are there nights where you just won't have much Coors at all? How does it usually look when you've got like a Coors Field game that's super, super popular, but also very expensive?
Yeah, lots of little features that will matter for that depending on.
And I know it depends
size.
if there's good teams, there's a lot that goes into it for sure.
More often than not, I will have some, but not a lot of that team. And probably not in full stacks. I'm more likely to just have pieces of that game in lieu of just grabbing it all. But if I'm manually building a lineup, let's say, I might have my hand in the pivots a little bit more, or I can manually get to a Rocky that I might see as slightly underowned, get that guy in there, swap out one chalky bat that's not part of the stack, and suddenly I have a lineup that is still getting me Colorado, but not necessarily just overly chalky. I'm not expecting like anybody else to have it or anything along those lines. So you kind of have to toe the line. Baseball's sort of like golf in that there kind of is like an upper bound to how successful anybody can individually be, no matter who they are. It gets weird because like you would think Mike Trout would just be awesome all the time. And in the grand scheme of things, like his score is, but he's kind of like a net neutral based on his ownership. The only time you ever really see wild and weird ownership is just fully incorrect pricing. Right. Broken. Some pitcher is accidentally 5K when he should be 9,500 or something. It's really hard to see chalk like basketball in baseball.
Right. There's no question about it. Yeah. Or unless you've got like a $2,500 player leading off for the Yankees, you'll see similar ownership, but it's uncommon for sure. Yeah. Alex, when we talk about stacking, there's a couple different. I've seen people do it different ways on Fantasy Cruncher, but what do you think the best way to approach stacking on Fantasy Cruncher is?
Yeah, I think that the best way on Fantasy Cruncher is you go to team stacks and you kind of set a cap for each team and make a lot of lineups that have different teams stacked. And then once you do that, you can use the sorting mechanisms on Fantasy Cruncher to eliminate some of the bad lineups that you end up with, like the low projected ones or the really high owned ones. And then you can find ones that are kind of in the sweet spot. And I just want to add a little bit onto what Josh was talking about with Coors is like, sometimes like Coors, the guys are priced really high and that funnels you into that value pitcher. So like suppose, Jack Flaherty was like 7K and he's projected for 20 and everyone is taking him to make a really stacked lineup and getting Coors. Well, then maybe you can find a really unique lineup construction that gives you a path to victory by like stacking the team going up against them or just picking a different pitcher that's a bit more of a long shot. So it's all about finding a way to get that path to victory, like Jake was saying.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting when you look at a spot where, like you said, Coors is super popular. You have a cheap pitcher, and you can get funneled into lineups way too often. And a lot of people do it because they think it's the best build, Jake, but they're not zooming out and seeing that everybody else is being funneled and forced into that exact same build. And that's where you definitely run into issues.
Right. Like, if Coors, and we keep talking about Coors, like Yankee Stadium, they're going to have a bunch of 6 totals. Like throughout this year, they're going to be super popular, a bunch of slates. Like if you just use projections and you don't factor in ownership, you're going to end up with maybe like 50, 70, 100% of Yankee stacks. You just crunch the top 150 lineups, put in your stacks or whatever. But then you're probably like, especially if they're expensive, you have the same lineup construction and everything. And different lineup constructions can like really, really help you just not only get unique exposures across your different stacks, but it might get you on something that you weren't even expecting. Like there might be a team in the top stack tool that has an 8% chance of being the top stack, but if they're 2% owned, like that should be a team you should be looking at. So, I mean, that's kind of how I think about it, but I don't know. I'm never even close to all in MLB. Like I think MME is the player 20 max or even 3 max. I think you can get diversified pretty well on that. So it depends on your play style. I suppose you could do 150 lineups of one team or a couple teams, but that's not really the way I think any of us play.
Are there ever times where you won't stack at all, or at least not 4 stacks into your lineups on a specific slate?
I don't know. I try not to force anything. I mean, I really trust Alex's projections. They're not going to be correct. Like we've got Cody Bellinger for like 9.5 DK points. He's not going to score 9.5. You put Cody Bellinger in your lineup to score 20 or 25 points. But yeah, I basically always stack like at least. I mean, tomorrow's a little bit different because it's a 2-game slate, but on a bigger slate, I try to get in as many 5-mans as possible. But I think Alex was talking about it and Adam yesterday on the show. Some nights you can't 5-stack the best team, or those lineups don't project well enough to be in consideration. So you might have to drop down to a 4-stack, 4-3, 4-4. But yeah, I think you should always stack in MLB.
All right, Josh, let's dive into this a little bit. Hey, hit that thumbs up if you haven't done so yet. And if you're new to the channel, if you're new to Awesemo, subscribe, hit that notification bell as well so you always know when we got new content coming out. Let's take a look at Thursday's slate. And then I kind of want to integrate a little bit of hand-building lineups into this as well. Talk about player exposures and how to make adjustments there, how to eliminate bad lineups, and how to do your lineup sorting on Fantasy Cruncher. Like Alex just said, you can get rid of low scoring lineups. You can find that sweet spot. Hopefully we can show you how to do that because that is very helpful. But the first things first, Josh, taking a short slate like this, and I think we're going to have a decent amount of them this year with some, obviously day games. And then you've got some of these slates that's like 3-6 o'clock games. So depending on what you're playing, we're going to see some pretty abbreviated slates. How do you approach them when it comes to, say, running a crunch with hitters versus pitchers, or could be manually building them? How many hitters versus pitchers you're willing to have on a 2-game slate, and whether or not actually allowing more than one into your lineup could make you different from everybody else and actually give you an edge?
Yeah, for me personally, the most that I'm ever doing is 1. There's probably some scenarios where 2 is valid. If you had like a Coors game and some other really high overall total game, I could see a scenario where 2 would work. And for me, it's only 1 because it's a 2-game slate. If you're anywhere really north of probably 4, I probably wouldn't ever have a hitter against my pitcher. There's going to be enough of a player pool at that point that you don't need to have someone, because ultimately your goal, for all intents and purposes, your goal is to like accumulate home runs. Obviously there are other stats that you can get. You can have a day where somebody's 3 for 3 with 3 triples or something, but ultimately like home runs are getting you where you need to be. Stolen bases are great as well. And if you're searching for that home run, so to speak, you don't want to have too many of them coming off of your pitcher, or he's simply just not in the game any longer. On a short slate where it's only 2 games, you don't have much of a choice. You probably need to bring someone back, or at least give yourself the capability to have one more coming back. But more often than not, it's not something that I'm doing.
Do you think it might be different in an opening night scenario like this, where a lot of these pitchers haven't had as much opportunity to get stretched out, and they might only go for 4 or 5 innings, some of them, and a lot of these plate appearances for the opposition might actually be coming against the bullpen?
Certainly possible. And we've seen for some of these guys, like how many home runs did Cole and Verlander give up last year? And
Cole gave up 29, I think, and Verlander gave up 40-some.
Yeah, so there's something to be said in that regard. Well, for one, you probably don't want to take too many hitters against Garrett Cole to begin with, because more often than not, you're just going to simply fail. But he's so good and allows so little base runners that a lot of the problems that he gives up, the home runs that he gives up, don't have anybody on. So they don't ultimately hurt him all that much. And you're happy to get that 14 points, or depending on what site you're playing on. Yeah, they could be going shorter. I haven't dug into how like expected innings or anything yet, or seen any props that have been posted yet for, expected amount of outs for each pitcher. I think it's a little unique for tomorrow in that we have, let's just say 3 aces, whatever you guys want to call Clayton Kershaw at this point in time. Still good, but maybe not Cole and Scherzer.
I know what I want to call the Giants offense.
The Giants pitching, not much better either, unless Johnny Cueto got a time machine during the offseason. So for tomorrow, I just can't imagine having anything more than 1. I can't see it. Not for tomorrow's slate.
What about you, Alex?
Alex might swing in and be like, I'm going to have 3, and I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board for everything that I do.
Are you open to having more than 1 hitter against your pitcher tomorrow, Alex?
So I think that obviously there's a negative correlation there because when the batter does well, the pitcher is going to lose points. So it's something that you should factor in as a negative in your lineup. But the reason I would do it is like to counteract that factor, you need to get some advantage. And the advantage I'd be going for here is salary relief. So like the Giants are all going to be really, really cheap because they stink. And if you put a Giant in your lineup versus, the pitcher, I can't remember the matchups tomorrow.
Kershaw against the Giants.
Okay. Thanks, man. Yeah. So if you put a Giant in and Kershaw, like you might be able to make a lineup that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And that has a lot of value because some people might eliminate that possibility right off the get-go.
Okay, yeah. Jake, your process for a 2-game slate. Kind of want to set this up, and then we'll get into some players, some lineups.
I think, just because you allow 1 player, 2 players, or 3 players in Fantasy Crunch, it doesn't mean that like the majority of your lineups is necessarily going to include the max. So
right.
I'll probably, I think for the most part, I'll probably stick with 2. And then I would say the majority of my lineups would have like 1 or 0. But there probably are some really good lineups you can make with 2 players against, let's say somehow Cueto has 7 Ks in 5 innings, but he gives up 3 solo shots or something like that. Like we still like the Dodgers bats. Cueto does well enough to probably be in the winning lineup, depending on how the rest of the slate shakes out. But like you could see 2 or 3 Dodgers for sure, just hitting solo shots. And if it's a low scoring slate elsewhere, you probably are going to need those guys. And it's probably going to be low scoring because Cole and Scherzer are in the other game. So like you can talk yourself into scenarios where 2 players or maybe even 3 could end up on a winning lineup. You have to be essentially perfect. Like you're going to have the optimal, I would think, to win these tournaments unless something really, really crazy happens.
Yeah, with such a little amount of players to choose from. Alex, how willing are you to, you kind of touched on it, how willing are you to go after, hitters on the San Francisco Giants?
Yeah, I think that even though like they're not nearly as good as the Yankees, Nationals, and Dodgers,
keep going.
or the other 26 teams. Yeah, they still have a decent shot tomorrow. I have them as a 17% chance of being the top stack of the night, and
pretty high.
The thing is, like, they're also really cheap. So I'm not thinking that people will be scared to go to the Giants. So they're not my favorite stack, but I certainly will have some.
What about, I'm just taking a look here. I wanted to take a look at ownership. What we have expected here for, what did you say what the ownership was for the Giants?
About 23%.
Okay. So
basically, what I'm expecting to happen tomorrow is like everyone's going for the Dodgers. They're going to need some cheap bats to make that work, so they might go to the Giants.
Okay. Makes sense. Yeah. Josh, what about pitchers on a slate like this? If you run a crunch, is it possible that, well, first of all, I know you do set caps on ownership, but like assuming someone doesn't have that capability, would you manually set ownership caps? Would you run it first and see what you come up with and then make adjustments?
Always run it first to see what you
unadulterated, right?
You always want that information no matter what. That should be your first step regardless. See, tomorrow is so interesting because of the disparity in talent from 3 pitchers to Johnny Cueto. It's honestly shocking. I didn't think that it was possible to have 3 guys be so much better than the 4th guy, but that is what we're getting. I'm pulling it up now just because I want to make sure that I have it in front of me to quote it. But the disparity between Cole, Scherzer, and Kershaw in comparison to Cueto, just from a fantasy projection standpoint, is nuts. So, well, just for draft, actually, it'll be easier to say this for FanDuel because we have top pitcher odds, but on DK, you're going to start 2 of them, so the numbers get a little higher. Scherzer's at 33%. Cole is at 29%. Clayton Kershaw is at 26%. Cueto is at 12% for those following along. 25% would be, in theory, average for this if everybody was the exact same guy. So Cueto, not even remotely close to the average for being the top pitcher tomorrow. He's going to come up in very few raw crunches. Because of his projection being so low, he's just not going to show up naturally. So if you're trying to get to something like Johnny Cueto, you're either going to have to hit him with a thumbs up or manually lock him, increase randomness. There are a few different methods you could use to get to him. Otherwise, anybody really using an optimizer is going to be generating very similar lineups, which has led us to the anti-optimizer plays that Alex was dropping during the deeper dive towards the end of the year last year.
The AOPs, yeah.
Yeah.
And we actually have now, this is something I'm personally pretty excited about, Alex. We've got the top, so we had the top stack tool, and then you started putting out like top golfer tools, top driver tools for NASCAR, for MMA, top fighter tools. Now we have a top pitcher tools, or a top pitcher tool. How does that work? Is it similar to the top stacks, except just with individual pitchers?
Yeah, exactly. It just gives you the chance that each pitcher will be one of the highest scoring of the night or the highest value. And you can compare that to the ownership. So that'll help you decide if it makes sense to maybe do an ownership fade based on the probabilities. And then, you could also think about maybe stack against the pitcher if their ownership's getting too high. And I think that if you compare it to the top stacks tool, that's a nice pairing.
Yeah. So Scherzer with a lot of ownership, but also much better value than somebody like Garrett Cole. You have to factor all of that stuff in. Jake, another thing you want to factor in here is player exposure. How do you go about getting player exposure that you feel comfortable with? Josh hit on it, but I want to kind of get into this a little bit more and drill down here. When it comes to exposure, it's probably one of the most common questions people get. Like, should I have 100% of this guy? Why do I only have 1% of this guy? You hear it all the time in the DFS space. What is a way to kind of get what you want, but also not go too far where you're just basically where you're essentially wiping out anything the projections and ownership would have to do with it?
Yeah, so every slate's different. We got 3 aces tomorrow that look like they're going to be all owned pretty decently. So whatever combination of exposure I end up with is probably going to be pretty comfortable. And then I would imagine, based on the top pitcher tool, I would be more likely to be over the field on Cueto, especially on DraftKings, and allowing hitters against my pitcher and stuff like that. But if you have Fantasy Cruncher, it does that for you. Even when you eliminate lineups, it recalculates your exposure. So we talk about, like, if you're making 150 lineups, let's say for like the mini max or the $10, and you wanted to cut out the top 25 total ownership lineups, you could delete those. It's really easy in FC. You click on you right click on the check mark at the top of a lineup. You sort them however you want, right click.
You taught me that. I had no idea a couple of years ago that you could right click that check mark at all.
Yeah. I think they had it last year, but anyways, game changer.
Or last year you showed me that. At some point you showed me and I was blown away.
Yeah, I don't know. Learn something new every day. I'm sure there's a ton of things I still don't even know how to do on Fantasy Cruncher, or ways that I can improve my process. It's just a really good tool. And so if you're trying to cut down on lineups, Fantasy Cruncher will recalculate. And then you can recalculate again if you wanted to take off another 25 lineups, or if you just wanted to go through and manually delete. So that's how I think you can keep track without Excel. It's pretty easy to do it on Excel, but if you're not comfortable with it, Fantasy Cruncher does it for you. And in general, tomorrow I might have a hitter at like 50 or 60% just because there's so few. But on a normal slate, like on a Friday slate, I think it's 11 games we've got on Friday. I'd be pretty comfortable having hitters in the 20 to 30% range, 40% if it's a really good play or a really high leverage play. And then pitching, I don't really think you necessarily need to cap. Like there were slates last year where Blake Snell ended up being like the only ace, and he was underpriced. Like, I'll have 100% of that guy if that's how it shakes out. So pitchers, definitely more predictable, even though there's still a lot of variance, but sometimes it's just a can't miss pitcher, whereas that doesn't really exist for hitters. So much more likely to cap 30 or 40% or lower.
Okay, Josh, let's kind of apply this right now. So I just put Awesemo's projections in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And ran a crunch, nothing else. Ran 300 lineups and got 97% Max Scherzer, 92% Max Cole. Now Garrett Cole. Now it's a 2-game slate.
Yeah.
You see something like that, right? So you've run it without anything. What is your next step?
Looking through my hitter stacks to see how similar all of those lineups really are. Is there a spread in exposure to any particular team? That would be the first place that I would look, because on the surface, when you only have 4 starting pitcher options and some of those guys are Max Scherzer and Garrett Cole, you're not exactly mad that you're getting 90% of those guys. Like it's hard to look at that and immediately think, well, that's going to be a problem. So I would immediately go to the hitting side to see how concentrated I am there. If I have one particular team that's overwhelming in my hitter stacks, then I know that everything that I just crunched is essentially some combination of team X plus Cole and Scherzer. And that is where I would see myself needing to mix it up, because from a pitching perspective, we don't have the option to really mix it up.
There
aren't that many combos.
No, but that's a great, even if it's a bigger slate, you could probably apply the same logic, right? Like if there are 2 pitchers that are easily the best. Hell, we opened up the lineup builder from July 19th, 2019, or July 22nd, 2019. Because we want to go use it to talk about hand building lineups momentarily, and all of the pitchers outside of like Garrett Cole were really not good at all. That would be something you could apply to even a bigger slate like that, where you say, look, I got a ton of Garrett Cole, but if my stacks are diverse enough, I'd be okay with that. Correct?
Yeah, but if I ended up getting 60% Garrett Cole and I also had 75% 4-man Rocky stacks,
then it's a problem.
I'm basically running the same and again, it's not necessarily that it's a problem. I mean, it could be a problem. There's nothing wrong with having a very concentrated core of a pitcher and the same team. You're just going to have really long stretches of time where you do not win.
Well, okay, that's a perfect segue to throw to Alex here, because Alex, I've seen many times where you'll have the winning lineup, right? You'll win a tournament, and then you won't find another one of you. And I love this conversation because I think it's so. Jake's shaking his head because we've talked about this a lot on the strategy show. It's pretty remarkable. You'll have a winning lineup, and then you might not have another lineup like in the top 500, but you took first place. And that's such a difficult thing to do, I think, for a lot of people, is to spread themselves out enough where they're being smart, giving themselves, where it's like each of those 150 lineups individually gives itself a chance to compete. And I know that you said you don't like having your lineups compete against each other. It's not that common where you see someone play 150 or 100 or 50 in a smaller field contest and like they win, but that's really the only lineup that did anything crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I see people all the time. They'll take first, second, third, fifth, seventh when they have their night. And to me, that's a big leak, because you're basically depriving yourself of getting first by having a lineup that beats your own lineup. So, like, obviously getting first is such a big percentage of the prize pool that it's essential that your lineups aren't competing too much with one another. And there are a lot of different ways to differentiate, but one good way is through uniques. If you build lineups using like 3 uniques on Fantasy Cruncher, that at least make sure that you don't have too much overlap in your lineups. Of course, at the end of the day, you're more worried about the overlap with every single lineup, but you don't have much control over that. So at least do it between your own lineups.
All right, so now we're getting into the good stuff. How many uniques would you set for a 2 or 3 game slate?
On baseball, I think you could do at least 2 uniques for a 2-game slate. With 3 games, there's enough possibilities that you could do 3 uniques and be fine, I think.
And Josh, what about randomness? So I mentioned run a crunch untouched, just upload projections. You're going to get, by the way, this could be on a bigger slate where you still get like 90% of a pitcher. That's not uncommon at all. How do you treat randomness if somebody is looking to they're looking at this, they don't really know how that works. We just talked about 2-3 uniques and a smaller slate. You could do 2 hitters against a pitcher, but what about randomness?
Yeah, so 2 separate answers. One, you can use the normal distribution randomness if you have FC Pro, which I highly recommend that you get if you're subscribing to Fantasy Cruncher. With that said, you're going to use a different amount for non-normal distributed randomness than you would for the other. It creates different sorts of extremes. It kind of goes hand in hand with using uniques. Randomness gets tricky because there's a point where you're making worse line. Baseball's a little different because opportunities come differently. Let's say in the NBA, for example, I wouldn't want to use a ton of randomness. I would want to rely a little bit more on my projections because I wouldn't want to open myself up to getting lineups that are just kind of bad. A lot of the bottom of the barrel type stuff, if you grab the wrong sort of fake randomness numbers that come up. In baseball, since every 7 hitter is getting the same sort of opportunity of hitting after the 6 hitter, I think that you could open it up a little bit more, but I personally am a relatively low randomness guy. I want to rely more on my projections in that case. So 5 to 10% is pretty much where I'm generally going. This is another one of those situations where depending on what you're trying to do, you can crank that number up considerably. I don't want to have too much wiggle room around my projection, so I'm using a pretty low number.
Okay, and that's the reason I ask is because baseball's strange where if a guy's projected at 10.6 and another's projected at 10.45, like if your randomness is at 0 and you don't have caps set on those guys, there's a good chance that you'll get all of the guy at 10.6, none of the guy at 10.5, even though the projection is shockingly close and there really isn't much difference there at all.
That's a good way to figure out how much randomness you probably should use. Run that unencumbered crunch, see how 2 guys with essentially the same projections look at the same salary point, and increase your randomness accordingly so that if there's a huge gap between the 2 of them, it shrinks.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. Jake, what about you when we're talking about you get your lineups, you look at your ownership, you look at what you've got a ton of these pitchers, you've got a ton of this stack, and let's say you run into the same issue that Josh talked about, right? So let's say it's a 4-game slate even, and you get like all Rockies and a ton of 2 different pitchers. What's your next step?
Yeah, so I was going to mention that. So the way you can do that on Fantasy Cruncher is you got your little player exposures at the bottom left. Once you generated all your lineups, whether it's 100, 150, 20 lineups, you can go into the team stacks function. You got stacks or combos. You can look at combos and see, all right, like you might have flat exposures, but like Josh was saying, maybe you have Coors with like 75%, or you have 75% exposure to Coors when you play Garrett Cole or whatever. And then those Coors stacks are all stacked with like the Blue Jays or someone that's always cheap, that's always the same filler. So I would try to avoid having 50 of the same 2-man combos. That's how you're going to end up getting like what Alex was talking about, guys winning 1st, 3rd, 7th, 10th in a large field tournament, which is not necessarily what we're trying to do. So what I would do is probably increase my randomness a little bit. If I'm getting a bunch of teams together over and over and over again. Or what you could do is go into advanced options, team stacks, whether you're doing a 5-3 or 5-2 or 4-4, whatever it is, and just kind of lower the stack exposure. So you will get a shuffled amount of stacks, and you won't keep ending up on the exact same combo lineup after lineup after lineup.
Do you always adjust team stack exposure, or are there some days where you just roll with it?
Like tomorrow, I'll probably, since I'm going to end up eliminating a bunch of lineups, I'll probably make like the main stack exposure like 40 or 50%, so that like I have main stacks of all these teams, the bad ones, the ones that project 50 points below the optimal or whatever, like full stacks against Scherzer or Cole, like those will get eliminated anyways. So in terms of lineup generation, I don't have a problem with it if you're going to cut out 50 or 100 lineups. But if you're not, like maybe if you're just going to crunch 150 and upload them, which I don't necessarily recommend, I maybe wouldn't. I would maybe just increase your randomness a little bit rather than limiting your stack exposure.
Alex, we'll hit on this quickly because a lot of people know how to do it and some people still don't. But I know it's something that confuses a lot of people. When you're actually setting up stacks, how is it that you can set up your 5 players, your 4 players, your 3 players, and have it with like a 5-2 or a 5-3 or a 4-4?
Yeah, so I think that the easiest way is you just pick one stack and you kind of roll with it. So the best ones are typically 5-3 on DraftKings and 4-4 on FanDuel. The advantage of doing it that way is that you can't build a lineup that's going to be dominated by other lineups where you're making, for example, you pick a lineup that has a one-off instead of stacking that player, and then because of the correlations, you might be a big underdog. So I think that is how I would start, is just limiting myself to those stacks. As you get more advanced, you can start setting some different stack configurations, use the constraints a little bit. But that's only going to really work to full effectiveness if you're able to account for how strong those lineups are in relation to each other.
Okay. And Josh, as far as going to advanced settings and team stacks, I think to some people it's kind of daunting. You look at it and people are looking at it from a different angle than the actual utility is there for. If you go into it, let's say for tomorrow's slate, what would you be setting up in the team stacks?
Yeah, so I'm going to run a couple different things, most likely. And it's going to be a little different on FanDuel compared to DraftKings. You can do 5 on DK. You can only do 4 on FanDuel, 4 on the pitcher on FanDuel. I'm going to do as many 4-4s as I could probably get to come out, which is going to be limited on a 2-game slate. Then I'm going to look at some 4-3. I'm speaking from a FanDuel lens, at least for right now. I'm going to run a chunk of 4-3s, probably some 4-2-2s, maybe a couple 3-3s. Like I'm trying to run a stack of multiple different stacks. Maybe run 100 or 200 lineups. If I'm just speaking generally, run 200 lineups on 5 different combinations of stacks. You can merge all of those crunches together and then have one big 1,000 lineup crunch, at which point I would start working off of that to start lopping things off from the top or bottom. Because there's not really a right or wrong answer to what sort of stack you want.
So you could
better, but it's tough.
So you could let's take a step back for a second, because I think this is important. So you can, by the way, it's very easy to merge crunches. For anyone that doesn't know how to do that, it's pretty simple. So it's just in the where is it? Selected lineups. I forget.
After you generate your lineup, so there's a drop down in the top left section that says. You can create a blank one, which is what I like to do, and then transfer everything. I create a blank lineup, which you could do in that actions drop down. So then I rename that one to be like, this is my actual crunch, so that I don't accidentally delete it. Then I start running the rest of my crunches, and you select that entire crunch, and you can either move or copy to another crunch. So that is what I like to do. I like to keep them all separated. I'm really weird like that. I like to rename my crunch tab so I know what's what. I get too in the weeds with this stuff too much, but the features are there for a reason.
Would you create like a 200 with a 5-2-1, 200 with a 4-4, 200 with a 5-3, maybe a 3-3-2. I'm just throwing, numbers out here, and then merge them and see what you get.
Yes, absolutely. Now there is sort of like a piece of, I don't even know how to totally account for it. So we might have to throw this to the boss man, at least in FC. You have to worry a little bit because the more constraints you set, the less like your fantasy points aren't going to be as high. That doesn't necessarily make that lineup worse, but if you're forcing 4 4s, you're going to get a lot of lower projected fantasy.
And depending on how you sort, they might get lopped off.
A lot of them are just going to get lopped off right off the bat. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they should be. You just have to figure out a way to adjust for that information to put that lineup on the same. Because if you run crunches without any stacks whatsoever, those are going to be your highest projected lineups, full stop. But that is not necessarily what you want to do either. Maybe in a cash game, that's a little different scenario. But in GPPs, it's going to seem like you should do that, but you actually shouldn't do that.
That is really important right there. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's throw it over to Alex. So based on, Josh is right, Alex. If you're just sorting by projected fantasy points, you're not going to get a lot of lineups that could end up winning because they're different. So what are we using to make sure that we're not just cutting off everything because it's projected lower? And I guess that's where ownership comes in as well. So take us through those steps. I think this is really an important factor in being able to use Cruncher the right way.
For sure, yeah. I think that anytime you introduce stuff like randomness and player exposure caps, you're going to end up with a lot of lineups that might not be ones you want to enter. So the easiest thing to do is you generate 4 or 5 times the number of lineups you want to enter, and then you eliminate some of the ones that don't meet the criteria you want. So that could be like a projection that's too low, ownership that's too high. And I mean, you can create your own metrics as well. And then you can kind of narrow the lineups you generate down into that number you want to enter, and you'll be good to go.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's do this. Talk a little bit of hand building lineups. Before that, though, Jake, Josh, Alex, anything else here do you find to be integral to making good lineups on Fantasy Crunch? I want to make sure we hit on everything here because one small leak, one small blind spot can create a world of difference in a very bad way. So anybody, if you guys have something, jump in. If there's something we need to hit on that we haven't hit on yet that is huge in terms of being able to be successful in building good lineups on Fantasy Cruncher.
I'll give a tip here is that I find a lot of times setting a player exposure cap instead of a team stat cap is a little bit more effective. And the way you can do that easily is one way you can do it is you set the ownership cap for each player equal to their projection in the upload tool. That won't work in a 2-game slate, but in a larger slate, it should be decent. Or set it to be 2 times the projection. Or you can take our ownership projections and you set the player exposure cap to be a little bit higher than the ownership projections. And that'll kind of mimic what everyone else is doing when you build your lineups.
Huh. Okay. So I hadn't thought about that way before. That's a very easy way to do it if you don't have a way to generate ownership caps on your own. Cool.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can make your own formula or something, but those are 2 easy ways to do it quickly.
Okay, awesome. Josh, Jake, anything else on Cruncher?
I don't have anything to beat that one.
That's
I guess
solid.
If you're ever curious about this stuff, the best thing that you can do is open up lineup rewind in Fantasy Cruncher. Go back to old slates and figure out what the changes that you make. Figure out what happens when you switch from 1 unique to 2, from 2 to 3. Figure out what happens when you switch from 0% randomness to 50% randomness. And don't necessarily just judge it based on if those lineups become profitable or not, or if they became the winner or not. Try to see how it impacts the way that your exposures come back out. What does the spread of pitching look like if you change the uniques? What does the spread of pitching look like if you change the randomness or limit your player pool in any way? Lineup Rewind is there for you, and that is an invaluable tool if you want to practice using Fantasy Cruncher and not have to worry about one specific slate.
And just to add something to that, one mistake that, Josh, we've discussed it 1,000 times on shows that people make is they go into Lineup Rewind and they're trying to replicate the lineups that won the big tournaments the night before.
Yeah, which is one of those weird things where on the surface, your first thought is like, well, yeah, I want to do whatever the winner did. It rarely gets talked about that the winning lineup is, in theory, a bad one. It just happens to be profitable for you.
Right. Like if it's
more
Alex's
often than not,
lineup,
it's hard to fix that. Right. It also depends on whose results you're trying to
if you know it's
chase.
a successful routine winner, then it's like, all right, I'd love to know what they did, but not somebody you've never heard of. Go ahead. Because like you're saying, it's generally speaking, a lot of those lineups are lineups that you probably on a daily basis aren't trying to make.
Exactly. If my wife happened to play daily fantasy sports and threw a single bullet into the millie and won it, chasing her process of finding that lineup is probably not the answer for you. You just don't want to go that direction. Lineup Rewind will let you see what your changes are doing. Don't pay too much attention to whether or not that lineup ultimately cashes in whatever tournament you're looking at. That's not going to help you in the long run and will probably help reinforce bad habits.
Yes, 100%. Jake, anything else on Cruncher?
No, I agree with everything Alex and Josh said. Just when you get a FC subscription, I think Lineup Rewind is Lineup Rewind still free? I don't know. I've had it for so long. Is it not?
I don't think that it is any longer.
Okay, well, get a Fantasy Cruncher subscription through us, and just kind of play around with it. Like Josh said, you can play with old slates on Lineup Rewind before you even risk real money, before you're comfortable and start at the low stakes, whatever the lowest stakes possible that you're allowed to play, and just experiment a little bit with uniques and with all this stuff we're talking about. It's going to be different for every person. Like everyone's process is different, but like Alex's process compared to another great DFS player, Brick or Petty Theft, like those guys all do way different things in Fantasy Crunch, I'm sure. So there's no necessarily wrong way to go about it if you are comfortable with your process.
Steven asked if there's any thoughts on showdown lineup building. That's for another show.
Yeah.
That's definitely for another show. I know Alex has put a lot of time into that, so we could hit on it some other time. Let's talk a little bit about hand building lineups though. We have the lineup builder at Awesemo.com too, which is really helpful if you're looking to do something like that, whether it's hand building for a single lineup or 3 max. Some people even hand build 20 max. It's a variety of possibilities. So you've got the lineup builder, you have the projections, the ownership, the top stack tools, all of them developed and used by Alex Baker himself. It's not just slapping his name on there. He uses these tools, and he's the number 1 ranked player out there. So, you do the math if it's a good investment or not. And we're giving away all this good free stuff so you can learn how to use that stuff, whether you're a premium sub or not, to Awesemo.com. But you can go to Awesemo.com/join and see everything we've got to offer. Not only that, but we've got a bunch of promo codes to use at checkout if you want to get in on this action with baseball and basketball returning, PGA in full swing. UFC has been a hell of a lot of fun. You've got Manfred, one word, like Rob. It is Rob. Manfred, one word. Josh,
it would have been really weird if we, first of all, one word is
/Fred.
Yeah, it would have been really weird if we came up with that code and it had no tie to Rob Manfred.
I just like to make it more difficult than it is. Now it's 15% off your Awesemo Plus monthly MLB package. So with baseball coming back tomorrow, you get 50% off when you use the code Manfred. That sure is a strange one. But it is MANFRED, Man and Fred. Put them together. You've got Manfred. $25 for 31 days of Awesemo Plus MLB stuff. Look, again, it's everything that we have to offer for $25 on the month. Friday, July 24th is the last day that you can get it. Or, and this is the one I would recommend personally because sports are coming back in a huge way. If you use the code at checkout, restart, you get 50% off the entire site for a month. So it's $45 for a month. projections, all of the tools, all of the premium articles and content, the lineup builder, you name it, everything for $45. That's half off by using the promo code RESTART. So get in there today. Check that out. Go to awesemo.com/join and check out all of the subscriptions that we have to offer. Again, Manfred, 50% off Awesemo Plus monthly MLB package. And for 50% off your Awesemo Plus monthly pass, it is RESTART. Both of them, one word, of course. All right, let's do this. Talk a little hand building. Alex, I'll start with you because you're the one that developed the lineup builder. And we can talk about that, but just, in general, building lineups by hand and what the process is, because I think there is kind of some synchronicity between having projections and ownership and still being able to build lineups by hand. They're not mutually exclusive. The only people that use projections and ownership aren't just people that run crunches.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that having some sort of angle going into building your lineup really helps speed along the process. So I think that you could go to the Top Stacks tool, or if you don't have an Awesemo membership, go to the sports book and look at the lines. Or I guess you can actually access those on our site too, on the lineup builder, even if you aren't a member. But they'll tell you who are the highest projected teams of the day. What are in the case of the Top Stack tool, what's their ownership? Another really important factor. What is the chance that each game is going to be postponed? And that's something that we have on the lineup builder too. Then the nice thing about the lineup builder is once you complete your lineup, it gives you feedback on that lineup. So it'll tell you how does it stack up in terms of projection to the field? How does it stack up in terms of ownership? And that helps you evaluate how good your lineup is.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Okay, so where do you find something like that if you're looking at where it stacks up against the field once you've got the lineup in there?
It just pops up next to the lineup. It tells you your ranking as far as ownership and projection, and then that gives you some idea of how you stand as far as, is your lineup contrarian enough? Is it highly projected enough?
Awesome. Yeah. And Jake, there are ways to use projections and ownership for building lineups by hand. I know you mostly use Cruncher, but let's say you are doing a single entry or a 3-max. What is your process?
Yeah, I would, just as a general rule, the way I like to build lineups is kind of choose your stack first, and then fill in a pitcher after that. So let's say you the Dodgers stack, and it's a bigger slate, and you're not worried as much about ownership on the stack necessarily. Even if they're popular, you stack up 5 of the best players, 4 of the best players, whatever it is. Then you're going to maybe want to worry about pitching. And then I would look to target some lower owned one-offs. Or if you're talking about a smaller field single entry, I would value correlation a little bit more. You have to be less perfect to win those. So taking guys on the same team, maybe look to a 5-3 build, do your 5-man stack, maybe find a 3-man that fits in, and then a combination of pitchers. But I don't know if it's right, but it's what I do. When I do a hand build, it is starting with the stack first.
Okay. What about you, Josh? So say you got a ticket. You got a ticket to a $530 entry contest, right?
Okay.
And you want to do it the right way. What is your way of throwing one lineup into a contest like that? And assuming it's assuming it's a single entry or a 3-max or something, not where you're just putting one lineup into the Millie Maker because, that they ain't going to get you too far.
Yeah. A lot of what I would do would be running a crunch of 3,000 lineups and parsing through all of that. But if we're talking about using Lineup Builder, it's a completely different story for me. And the first thing that I'm doing is the opposite of Jake, actually. I'm going pitcher first. I'm going to look at ownership specific. I'm going to assume that this is a single entry or a minimal entry contest. So the first thing that I'm doing is looking at ownership to figure out who the chalk pitchers are for that day. If I'm all over one of the pitchers that I believe are quite chalky, then my next step is immediately finding a lower owned, higher probability hitting stack to slot in with them. If I'm already making the difference by dropping down to a pitcher that's not picking up as much ownership, I'm more looking towards the higher probability top stack teams with less importance on how owned they are. So I'm playing those two sort of things off of each other. If I'm going chalky at pitcher, I'm not going to be as chalky for the stack. If I'm going not chalky at pitcher, I have no problem grabbing your typical cores type team. And then after that, it's sort of just making the pieces fit together. The way that I fill that out is going to be wildly up in the air.
Yeah, and Alex, to kind of extend on that a little bit, are you looking at pitchers first? Are you looking at hitters first? Are you not doing either? Is it a different process that you put into play? How do you do it when you're building a lineup by hand?
I'd probably look at hitters first. Sorry, Josh. But the reason why is at the end of the day, like, if I have a stack I want, I'm just going to pick the best pitchers I can get. And that it also depends DraftKings versus FanDuel, because on FanDuel where Josh plays more, you only get one pitcher. So that determines more of your lineup. If you're playing more on DraftKings, like two pitchers, you can kind of mix and match with your stacks. So I do like to kind of center my lineup around my stack, because I feel like that's the most pivotal choice.
Okay. Yeah, I think ultimately when it comes down to it, the big question always, Josh, is like, how do you use projections and ownership to actually create lineups by hand? And like you said, you'll oftentimes just crunch lineups and then take the one after sorting it. But again, not everybody has those same luxuries in terms of being able to sort them by ownership and by ceiling and stuff like that. So would you still use, like, okay, you could definitely still use and should still use something like the top stack tool for building lineups by hand. That's something that's extremely important to being able to find what those good stacks are. Because, instead of grabbing like 10 stacks, you might only be picking one stack or two or three stacks, but you can find the ones where you might have a little bit of leverage against the field.
Yeah, no doubt. And the size of the contest that you're entering plays a huge role here. If, like, let's say that's one seat out of 1,000, picking a relatively low top stack probability is not going to get you all that far. You don't have to get super different to win 1,000 person contest. You don't have to deviate all that much just to be different. Now, if those guys are still also, like, if they're low owned, but you're also getting what appears to be fantastic odds on them, high top stack odds or high top pitcher odds, then by all means continue. Baseball is a little bit different in those regards. But paying attention to how many people you actually have to beat also gives you a bit of a roadmap to how you can construct your lineup. You don't have to have a sea of 5% owned dudes in 1,000 person contest, because you just don't have, you don't have to try to be that different. It could come down to basically like a 2v2, all things considered, on a contest with that sort of size.
How much do you guys factor, Alex? How much do you factor Vegas in when you're hand building a lineup?
I think the Vegas, it's really like good information, because there are a lot of really sharp bettors that determine these lines. So, and because there's all the money behind it, pretty reliable as far as accuracy. So I think that if I was coming in without access to our subscription or anything else, then looking at Vegas is a great starting point. And it also helps you understand the ownership, because everyone else is looking at it too.
Hey Josh, you know who's back as a sponsor on the MLB shows?
I know what the actual answer is. I had a joke answer for this that I'm not going to use right now. No. I almost did, but I don't want to do that.
No.
I believe when we start a show tomorrow, we're going to be promoting SuperDraft.
It's back, baby.
I couldn't be happier either.
Oh, I know. SuperDraft.io, or you can check it out in the App Store. SuperDraft can be downloaded wherever. There are no salaries. It is straight multipliers, and that's what makes it so fun. Man, we talked about it so much with the NBA season, but now you jump into baseball, and here's how it works. Instead of Garrett Cole being 10,500, he has a multiplier of 1. Whatever he scores is what he gets. Whereas if you say, screw it, I'm playing Johnny Cueto. I'm running out a stack I'm going to run out a chalky stack, or I would just want to be different at pitcher. I'm playing Johnny Cueto. You get 2 times the fantasy points on Cueto. So let's just assume Cueto goes out there and he looks like his 2013 self. Highly unlikely, but let's just hypothetically say he does.
I wish I could look like my 2013 self.
Me too. That's what happens when you start playing DFS every day.
True.
It doesn't help you physically, but I've been trying to get better. I digress. Johnny Cueto, say he scores 15, you're actually getting 30 out of him. And that applies to everybody, pitchers, hitters. When basketball comes back, it's the same thing. Guys like Giannis and LeBron get only 1 times their salary, so they get exactly what they score. But other guys, value plays, if you think you've got good value, you can throw them in there. So here's the way it works. There is no salary in terms of you can play anybody you want. If you wanted to, you could play every top projected player on every slate. But that's not always the way to go, because a 1.8 times their production guy, a 1.8 multiplier could give you 38, 40 points, and now you got 80 out of him. You're out producing someone like LeBron if he scores 65. So it's a cool strategy, and you can use the same projections and projections that you would use for really anything else, but we've got all of that stuff at Awesemo too. So the good thing about this, if you haven't checked out SuperDraft, you go head over there and you can get some money back into your account immediately simply by using the promo code Awesemo10, all one word, AWESEMO 10, $10 free on your first deposit of $10 or more, or you get $20 free with your first deposit of $100 or more. Just use Awesemo10, download it in the App Store, go to superdraft.io and check it out today. It's a really fun time. All right, guys, closing thoughts here. We'll go to you first, Jake, then Josh, and we'll close it out with you, Alex. We got into a ton of Fantasy Cruncher stuff. We could go for another hour, but we'll save this for another time. Closing thoughts on Fantasy Cruncher, on lineup building, on tomorrow's slate, on baseball returning in general. Go ahead, Jake. It's all you.
Yeah, hopefully this was helpful to people that, maybe if you are an FC expert, maybe you learned something today, or you're trying to get into it, or you needed some tips on hand building. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter. You can tag me. I think my DMs are still open. So even if you're not a subscriber, I'd love to help out. You don't open your DMs still, Josh?
No, but I would certainly not be calling for people to slide into my DMs.
That's all right.
At least not the people that are in our YouTube chat.
He says that every time I say you can DM me as well. That doesn't bother me, man. I have the choice of just ignoring it if a crazy person jumps in. But hey, Jake, you know what? Don't let him shame you. Helping people and being available is not a bad thing.
Nothing wrong with it. I think 95% of my interactions, my DMs are usually pretty positive. So yeah, you're going to get the 5%, but no one watching this stream would be negative in our DMs. So
now you've worried him, Josh. You've concerned him.
Should know better.
No, but seriously, just feel free to reach out if you're in Slack. Ask some questions about building and what we do. It's not, I'm not saying anything I do is perfect, but I can just help you out and maybe tell you the way that I've had some success doing things.
Awesome. Everyone shoot Jake a DM. Let him know how your day is going. Ask him what his favorite
just a sea of pictures.
Pictures. Josh, what do you have, man? Floor's yours.
Yeah, so don't slide into my DMs. You'll never be able to do that unless I already follow you as well, which is not likely. But you can message me on Slack. Be a premium sub at Awesemo.com, and you could hit me up on Slack whenever you want. Those are the direct messages. those are the DMs that you can slide into for me. Or if you need to, since this is a barrier for most people, josh@awesemo.com if you want to reach out via email, that technology that apparently no one uses any longer in lieu of DMs. But do that. Loughran and I are going to be back tomorrow breaking this one down for real. Strategy show is back, and I cannot wait to dive in. Get ready, 2-game slate. So Loughran and I should be done in about 2.5 hours. It's going to be good, man. It's going to be good. I cannot wait. Baseball is finally back.
It's going to run well through the afternoon and into the night, but that's what we're here for. No, the strategy show is back, and I could not be more excited. I think we can keep it pretty short for 2 games, but, let's not fool ourselves. Alex,
at least we got a lot of our banter out by having the daily show for a couple months.
It's actually pretty good.
We didn't have an outlet for it previously.
It's very true. Alex, what do you got? Everyone's waiting on you.
Well, first of all, thanks everyone for supporting us. I mean, that means a lot. And make sure to take advantage of all the different tools we're putting out there. I mean, first of all, the great video and written content, most of which is free on the site and on our YouTube. That will definitely help you break down the slate without having to dig into everything yourself. And then if you decide to become a member, there are a lot of great tools behind the paywall as well, like the deep dive article, really breaking down the advanced statistics. We have the top stacks and pitchers, the projections, the ownership. These are all really valuable tools in your arsenal. But another thing I want to mention, because we haven't talked about it at this show, is how you play is almost secondary to who you play, because at the end of the day, like, you have to be playing people who aren't as good as you to have a good chance at winning. So that's where contest selection comes in. So the biggest mistake people make is playing above their heads. So make sure to take advantage of the beginner and contests under $5, because those are limited to people who aren't as advanced. And then, the more people that are in every tournament, I think the better your edge is going to be. So that's where I would start off my focus of applying all these strategies. And then as you get more advanced, then work your way up.
Eloquent and wise from the boss man himself. No better way to close this out. And no, Seth, you don't have to ever play a catcher. I forget what that even was. God, that was a long time ago. But anyway, thanks to all of you guys for hanging out. I think everyone's really excited to have this back in our lives, and appreciate you being with us and supporting the channel. The simplest way you can do so is by hitting that thumbs up before you leave. It helps us a great amount for getting more exposure as well. So we appreciate you guys. We will see you back here tomorrow. Opening night. Baseball begins. And remember, hit us all up on Twitter. Give us a follow at Laffy_D, at Jake Hari, at Josh Engleman, and at Awesemo DFS. Until next time, thanks for watching us. Head over to awesemo.com/.